Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you again for joining today's training on Trauma-Informed Care, Movement Towards Practice. This training is presented by Switchboard, a one-stop resource hub for refugee service providers in the United States. My name is Meg Gibbon and I'm Switchboard's Deputy Director. I'm joined by a co-host today, Rebecca Mulqueen, Switchboard's Administration and IT Manager. You'll be hearing from Rebecca in the chat throughout today's training. I'd like to start by mentioning that today's training will run for 1 hour and 15 minutes and that it is being recorded. The recording will be posted on the Switchboard website and you'll be emailed a link to that recording in exactly 24 hours. The webinar transcript will also be posted on our site in the following few days. Let's take a quick look at some logistics here in Zoom. At the moment, all attendees are currently muted. We have a great group of participants on the line today. To switch between phone and computer audio at any time, you'll find the audio settings in the bottom left. We'd absolutely welcome your comments, your questions throughout today's session. We want to hear from you, so please click the chat bubble icon in the bottom center of your screen to open up the chat. You can send your chat message to all panelists and all attendees so that we're all able to view the message. And to test that out now, some of you are already doing this, I'd like to ask that if you're participating in this training with more than one colleague, but using a single computer, can you just please type your names and your organization into the chat so that we know who's joining today? And if you'd like to speak your question aloud during our dedicated Q&A period, which will be at the end, you can click the hand icon to raise your hand. Then we will give you permission so that you can unmute your line. So I see a couple hands raised to start. We will hold any questions until the end. At this point, I'm very excited to turn it over to today's facilitators. I'm so pleased to introduce Beth Farmer, Senior Technical Advisor for Safety, Education, and Wellness at the IRC, and Sasha Verbillis-Kolp, Independent Consultant. Beth and Sasha are both licensed clinical social workers with extensive experience providing trauma-informed case management and mental health services to refugees, survivors of torture, and other vulnerable populations. Over to you, Sasha.
Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. I'm so excited to be here today. I'm just thrilled with the opportunity to talk more about trauma-informed care. Our goals today for this session are to define what we mean by trauma awareness and really to see this as a developmental process by providing practical applications specific to the refugee context. We'll explore several different principles related to trauma-informed care through a series of examples. We'll look at different strategies that you can take in your setting that might be individually based or agency-based as you look at moving trauma-informed care along. We'll also emphasize throughout the presentation certainly the importance of cultural considerations and lived experiences. Go to the next slide, please. This work really draws upon several bodies of work that exist out there. So I just really wanted to acknowledge several of them here that you may see. Whether or not you have a strong orientation already in trauma-informed care, perhaps you're familiar with the sanctuary model from Sandra Bloom or many others, I just want to acknowledge that everyone is at a different place in terms of moving trauma-informed care or trauma awareness along. And you may find, as I have in this work, that there is always something more to learn, just as you may in terms of how you look at culturally responsive care. Move to the next slide. So what is trauma? How do we go about defining this? There's just so much work, as you know, this is a very broad topic, whether it be regarding the latest science, the newest trauma-informed evidence-based practice, or ways that you might look at evaluating your organization and becoming more trauma-informed. For example, recently, there was a new manual that just came out by Dr. Green and team out of University of Buffalo through the Institute on Trauma and Trauma-Informed Care. Some really wonderful resources in there that look specifically at the organizational way that you can move trauma-informed care along. Here in Oregon, we have been paving the way as well, and we'll cite some of that work later. Importantly, I do want to distinguish, though, that there are some differences between organizational level and then what we will be referring to through a series of different examples as individual approaches to trauma awareness. So let's look more at what we mean by some concepts and definitions of trauma. Here we have a very good definition set forth through sort of a Western psychology, right? As well as one by a wonderful trauma therapist that I've worked with in the past. When we look at increasing our understanding of what trauma is, we're looking at developing a common place and a common knowledge base so that we can see this awareness percolate throughout all our different encounters with clients and service users, and perhaps with our colleagues and coworkers. I really like, and I wanted to cite SAMHSA's definition of trauma as well. Trauma is the individual trauma that results from an event, maybe a series of events, a set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, that has this lasting adverse effects, perhaps on the individual's functioning, be it through their mental, physical, social, emotional, and spiritual well-being. We see here that trauma has to do with there being an extremely terrible or terrifying event or series of events. They may be cumulative. In the case of the refugee experience, we see that there are multiple events that people have lived through. It can be experienced by groups of people. It can be a collective experience. A whole cultural group may experience a specific type of trauma experience or event. I'd like to also expand our definition to include historical trauma. That is the type of trauma that we see around structural racism, oppression, and discrimination. This is an important aspect, I believe, to include in our working definition of what is trauma. Common themes that we have around trauma is that it is something that is so overwhelming that it can overwhelm the person's normal ability to cope with life circumstances. It may alter someone's most basic needs, such as safety, connection, place, and purpose. Trauma has these lasting impacts, we know, on the whole health, the whole mind-body continuum, if you will. And some other terms that you might hear us talk about today, or certainly you may source in the info guide that we've worked on putting together, is that there's complex trauma, there's toxic stress, and for our purposes, these are all included in our understanding of what we mean by trauma. So these are, again, some of the core attributes of what we mean by when somebody has survived and lived through trauma. It's typically something that is extraordinary, life-threatening, so extreme in its scope, it's unpredictable, uncontrollable, and may happen repeatedly. It often results in feelings of being overwhelmed, helpless, or at somebody else's control or mercy. It may have a negative physical, emotional, psychological, or spiritual impacts, as I mentioned previously. And we do know, and a lot of research and good interventions on trauma specific services really address the mind and body relationship and the lasting effects developmentally and on the body and on one's whole health that can happen as a result of surviving through trauma. Here we would like to invite a discussion related to the refugee experience and trauma. In your chat box, if you will, please type in which ones you believe are examples of trauma as it relates to the refugee experience.
Meg Gibbon here. You can either type your answer in the chat, like Sasha mentioned, and you also have the option to use the poll that I just opened. We'll keep that open for about 20-25 seconds, and then we'll close the poll. All right, I'll go ahead and close that poll now and let anyone who is still answering enter any final response. And I will share those results out now. As for the chat, we saw several answers, many of them focusing around all of the above, all of these, or it could be all of the above.
Well, that's exactly what we may anticipate. See, it's a good reminder that everyone listening today, really, you are the experts. You have a deep understanding of the refugee experience and what you may be encountering in your respective service settings, whether you're in resettlement, whether you're providing core integration services, maybe you're in a healthcare setting, a school setting. The level of trauma and the amount experienced in relation to the person, their own inherent temperament, and their overall experiences, I think is what really matters here. And I just really wanted to emphasize that. There's a lot of factors, as we've talked about earlier and will continue to explore today, that may contribute to how we define and understand trauma. What really matters is the person's experience and interpretation of that. So for example, for a child who is 5 or 6 and has warm, loving parents, living in a refugee camp may not be traumatic. Yet for a parent who's trying to get clean water, has a lot of food insecurity and other types of challenges in which they're aiming to protect themselves and their child, it may be. So moving to a new country because one is forced to leave their old country and everything behind them is very different than getting your dream job in another country. Losing your job and immediately finding another one is quite different from losing your job and not being able to secure another one for your family and perhaps becoming homeless. I really love this slide because it's another great reminder for us to just be thoughtful of that it is really the individual's experience of what they have been exposed to, lived through, directly witnessing, observing, whatever it may be, and not necessarily the event itself that may be traumatizing. And I think that's just really important to remember. So you may personally think about a situation that you've had in your life in which you've experienced something adverse. Maybe it was something that occurred to you when you were younger. And you and another person maybe had a similar experience, but what you experienced is unique to yourself. So in this, I really want to draw upon the good work that we know of in our field on strengths-based practice. That is that even though people have been exposed and lived through or witnessed or directly experienced trauma, that there's so much recovery and resiliency despite these adverse experiences. When we take a strengths-based approach, this means that we keep in mind all this inherent capacity that we have as humans to learn, grow, and to change. The human spirit is incredibly resilient. And while trauma and abuse are so injurious, they impact our bodies, our beings, our souls, our spirits, they also can be tremendous sources of opportunity for growth and new development. When we're talking about cultivating a trauma awareness or developing a trauma lens, it's helpful for us to first emphasize what we mean by a trauma response. Trauma-informed care as a movement, as an organizational movement, if you will, has really set forth to establish this as being paramount in our service systems. The important thing to understand is that when somebody has been exposed to trauma or experienced it, that the body and mind have an automatic response. That is that we're going to do everything that we need to do to respond to an active threat. Before we actually process perhaps what is happening, this is just an automatic, natural body-mind response. And so every interaction that a survivor may have within a respective provider system, whether it be how they enter into your physical waiting room space, how they engage with your paperwork, who they're interacting with, whether it be case managers or clinicians, what they experience related to the assessment process and procedures that you go through, how they understand and receive the rules and policies can either have the potential to calm a trauma response or activate one, depending upon how those things are messaged and offered to the individual. Over time, a person's beliefs and actions can certainly be experienced by these different influences. So this fight-flight response is, again, just a very natural response that happens to people. People may be familiar with the polyvagal theory and a lot of good science that has come out on this that I can point people to. I just really want to emphasize for us in our work that we can inadvertently reactivate this trauma response, and that it may be a very natural response for somebody, that even though trauma isn't directly happening, their body and mind may react to something, like when they're feeling stressed or overwhelmed, having to find a new job, having to locate new benefits, securing stable housing, whatever it may be. That response might get activated during times of acute overwhelm, and to kind of be on the lookout for that, and explore ways that you may work to mitigate that. In our second part 2 webinar on January 29th, we'll be exploring a lot more in depth about when that trauma response may become manifest, and steps that you can take to help de-escalate a potential conflict or challenging experience with a client. So now we move onward in exploring what we mean by trauma-informed care. So we've already defined trauma, which, as you know, there's not a one-size-fits-all definition of trauma. Similarly, we could apply that to what we mean by trauma-informed care. But as you recall earlier, I mentioned how this is really an organizational change model, and that you can source good resources out there for how to move your organization through this process of becoming more trauma-informed. Really, what we're imparting upon today is this first layer that we call trauma awareness. And this is how you can embed trauma messaging in different core actions throughout your service setting so that it becomes more trauma informed. It's important to note that this work is always evolving. New research continues to emerge, particularly around how to evaluate whether or not your organization is trauma informed. There's great work coming out of schools, the criminal justice system, through other health and human service, direct services, and so on. We still have a lot to learn, though, I would like to emphasize, around how we integrate the cultural expressions of trauma and look at it from unique ways that people develop resiliency and coping related to their own cultural beliefs and practices. So again, when we talk here about trauma-informed care and practice, we're really focusing on this developmental phase, and hopefully if you have really robust trauma-specific services, you can still see this as being very instrumental to your work. Dr. Mandy Davis and colleagues here in Oregon, out of Portland State University, they have formed a group called Trauma Informed Oregon. They've done some really wonderful work looking at this systemic macro level implications of trauma-informed care. I really like this because it allows us to see in this diagram how trauma is designed, sort of erodes away and violates these different aspects of an individual. Therefore, trauma-informed care as an organizational movement and practice is a commitment to not repeat these kind of harms again. The goal behind it then is to restore a sense of safety, power, and worth. These core principles will get addressed a little bit later when Beth joins in our webinar today. So organizations can make this commitment to cultivating trauma awareness, at the same time embrace a universal understanding that there's been and continues to be an ongoing impact of historical trauma, and that through different practices, policies, and procedures, that people can integrate more programming that addresses these principles of safety, the restoration of power, empowerment, dignity, and value to the individual. Let's keep in mind, importantly, that every interaction that a service user, a trauma survivor, someone may have within a provider system, like entering the physical space, how they may interact with your front office staff, and so on, either has that potential to activate that trauma response that we talked about earlier or not. So it's really important to address head on what some of these experiences may look like for people that have survived trauma. So trauma is pervasive. This lens that we try on in our work, becoming trauma informed as an individual or as an organization, suggests that we see this as a diffuse situation, right? We can anticipate that many people have lived through many adverse events. And importantly, trauma disproportionately affects those that have different risk factors and vulnerability, like those that live in poverty, or those that have experienced different inequities, those that have access barriers, whether it be related to food security, housing, and other elements to their lives. Those that have lived through any type of trauma may have different experiences in how they then navigate these provider systems. And unfortunately, some of our systems that we have by design were not set up with this trauma lens or awareness in mind. So we have a lot of deliberate work to do in terms of how we break down those services so that it does not re-traumatize or reactivate someone. And that's a little bit more of what we'll talk about here later today. So when we say trauma-informed care, there's these different levels in which we can apply it at. We've talked about policy and practice and procedure that embraces trauma awareness. I want to emphasize that this ideally is a very parallel process, or sorry, this is a very horizontal process that at the top of organizations with your management, your leadership, and then those that are providing the core direct services, that everyone is embracing to the best of their ability a shared understanding of what we mean by trauma, and that this messaging is commonplace within the organization. What can happen is that you might have a specific program or certain staff that have this orientation, but they are challenged with how to situate that within the organization, where there may be other layers within the organization on a cultural level that are not so trauma informed. So that's where some really good work can happen, is how do you then make this a very horizontal transformative process across all these different levels within your organization. So just to give some ideas here, organizations that change effort, this might be some strategic goals that you have in mind that are trauma informed. I want to remind people that this work can take a good while. Maybe there's changes that you make within your hiring practices. You explore what your supervision models look like. Maybe you look at them becoming more trauma informed. Maybe you explore what your leadership decision-making processes are and how those can become more transparent and trustworthy. On a programmatic level, you could be exploring how you could work with a trauma-informed change consultant to come in and work with you and design different committees that allow you to become more trauma-informed. So, and then on the individual, this is really where we're looking at those day-to-day interactions. Again, I want to distinguish what we mean here by trauma recovery or these trauma-specific services to that of being trauma sensitive, because they are very different. When we're talking about trauma-specific services, we're referring to those that are very therapeutic. They promote healing, they promote recovery, and they may not be the spirit of what is being provided in core resettlement and integration services. In trauma sensitive, though, I think is the work that we are all doing in the sector that's really about bringing this trauma lens into view. And then that trauma informed care, this is where we're guiding policy, practice, and procedure. So when we are talking about the refugee experience and the relationship to trauma, we know that refugee situations are, human or man-made. This is a man-made phenomena, trauma for the most part. And the refugee experience, that of fleeing conflict, living displaced, and then receiving the possibility of resettlement, entails so many multiple losses. Women and children are particularly vulnerable, and there's forced and prolonged separations from loved ones. There's a lot of statistics that are out there. Many refugees have been close to or witnessed death. The rates are anywhere from 37 to 62%. Many have witnessed the killing of family members, up to 35%. And about up to 44% of refugee populations may have to be defined as survivors of torture. So this really is a reminder that the type of trauma that refugees have endured and experienced as a population suggests that it's a complex form of trauma. many have endured multiple or repeated traumatic experiences, and these may be cumulative over a period of time. And I think it's just really important to remember that. And at the same time, while there's these adverse exposures and traumas that are unique to the refugee experience, just because somebody has survived trauma does not mean that they're going to have a mental health diagnosis. And that just because somebody is of a refugee community, I really want to emphasize that we don't assume that a specific person has a certain experience because of that identity. So we'd like to invite more dialogue with the audience here and ask you to explore, do you know the term that describes the different phases of traumatic experiences which occur in refugee migration? These are pre-flight, flight, displacement, and resettlement.
Meg Gibbon here. You can type your answer into the chat if you're familiar with the term that Sasha mentioned. Great, seeing several responses. Some said not familiar or not sure, but we did see several come with the response that we had anticipated, which is triple trauma paradigm.
Hi, this is Beth Farmer, and I'm going to be taking the next couple of slides. Thank you so much for having me here. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the triple trauma paradigm, which really is kind of a fancy pants academic word to say that part and parcel of forced migration is a lot of different layers of trauma. And this is really important because as people experience trauma, especially when it's repeated and it's complex, hitting a lot of different sectors of their life, they begin to adapt to it. Because remember, our bodies and our minds are designed to help us survive. And when people adapt to this type of trauma and respond to this type of trauma on a consistent basis, even after they get to safety, some of these responses can really remain. And it can walk into our service setting and we interact with it as providers, and it's important for us to have awareness of that and know how to deal with it. So with the triple trauma paradigm, just real quickly, the pre-flight is often what makes people decide to leave their country is often great violence or fear of violence for themselves or their children. The fight and displacement itself, whether it's short-term or long-term, often has a lot of violence associated with it, and often a lot of deprivation and profound uncertainty. And then to not forget that resettlement itself is a type of trauma. People are having to remake their identity. They're almost always living in poverty. They have significant stressors on their life. They also may have great uncertainty around when their family will join them, what happens next, what kind of job will they get, what type of career or work they might get. And there's also just profound loss of a support system, loss of a job, loss of a country, loss of the future you thought you would have. It is just it's very important to remember that resettlement itself is a trauma.
Beth, Meg chiming in here. We got a good question in the chat that I thought you might take now, which is, how does this differ from complex trauma?
You know, I don't really think that it does. I think complex trauma is where you have, you know, often repeated trauma that impacts multiple areas of a person's life, whether it be employment, family, you know, pervasive violence, that it tends not to be single incidents, it tends not to be one type of incident, and it tends not to be isolated in one part of a person's life. And I think that the triple trauma paradigm, or what people who have to forcibly migrate go through, is a type of complex trauma. It's just interesting to look at it at the lens of what are kind of those different types of trauma that tend to be common within people who have had to forcibly migrate.
Great.
So I'm going to spend just a second to talk a little bit about how the brain and the body work together to respond to violence and trauma. And Sasha talked about this briefly, but it's important to know that we are primed to survive. And that's where you get that fight, flight, freeze response. And so when one is faced with a very significant trauma, especially one that's violent or threatening, the body has kind of this automatic response where you get this huge release of stress hormones that flood the body. You can get this tremendous amount of adrenaline that makes you run really far, or lift a car, or do things that you may not be able to do in normal circumstances. The blood rushes from your extremities to your core and to your heart beats faster. You stop doing essential activities, like some people will urinate or even void their bowels because the body kind of wants to rid itself of anything extraneous it has to do beyond surviving. And often the part of the brain that's activated is on the lower brainstem as opposed to the front part, which is more impulse control, thinking, those sorts of things. So the part that's survival gets much more activated, while the part that the front part of the brain dims a little bit. So when people have been through trauma over and over again, their bodies are primed to have this response. Over time, their brain and their body learn that the world is an unsafe place, and the ability to react quickly and navigate through the world as if it's an unsafe place is right there at the surface. Their brain and their body adapt to the situation that they're in to help them survive. Now, that is a good thing, actually. It helps keep people alive, and it helps keep them safe. But even when they reach safety, the brain and the body may not know that they're safe right now. This response may happen with the slightest provocation, when a car backfires, when their child's late from school, or when they see something on TV. You might see this with some of the clients that you work with, needing to repeat things multiple times, frequently feeling lightheaded or shaky, continuous worry, sometimes having great stomach pains or feeling like they have to go to the bathroom a lot. This can lead people to feel disabled. It can impair their functioning. It can get in the way of the things they want and certainly that they deserve to achieve. And the important, and why we bring this up here, is understanding where this comes from. It comes from exposure to violence, uncertainty, trauma. It is their body's way of adapting. That it may also come up in your work with them, that this awareness and how you work with this is part of trauma-informed care. So the next thing that we're going to kind of move into is how do we walk that talk? How do we put these principles and that awareness into practice? So SAMHSA, and there's a lot of folks who have different principles of trauma-informed care, and I think SAMHSA has some great ones. But in general, you're looking at these areas of safety, trustworthiness and transparency, mutuality and collaboration, and empowerment and choice. And I think it's also important to say what these look like for each person and how you address them is really going to depend on their gender, on their culture, and on their history. So for example, when you're trying to address safety in a client, it may really look different for somebody who is a female versus a male? What does safety look like for somebody who has a history of assault versus somebody who does not? Or somebody whose culture has a history of genocide versus somebody who's not. So to recognize that how you may approach this and address this is really influenced by people's own experiences and their history and their historical aspects of these things. I think it's also important to remember that just because people have experienced trauma, they are certainly not broken people by any measure. And it's not just, oh, we have to work differently with them because they've experienced trauma. I think these principles come into play because when people have experienced the triple trauma paradigm or complex trauma, these areas have been eroded. People's safety has been definitely eroded. They've often been in political regimes where they may have been an informant society, where they couldn't trust anybody, or they've even been betrayed by their neighbors or even by a loved one. What is said on the surface and what is real, there may be some real dissonance. That transparency may not have existed. They may have been not considered equal or been able to chart their course of their life and history, which leads to mutuality and empowerment and choices. Their ability to affect the future, to affect their life or move forward has really been impaired. So it's not that, oh, we have to practice differently because people have had trauma. It's really the recognition that these things have been impacted and often eroded for people who have experienced trauma. We need to be aware of that, and the ways in which we work may change because of this. When we do trauma-informed care, when we put these principles into practice, it not only reduces the chance that somebody may be activated or re-triggered. It can also be really restorative to a person. It can make us much more effective in the work that we do. And it also helps us take care of ourselves because we're practicing in a way that not only is effective, but is also compassionate. So we're going to talk real quick about that first principle, safety, right now. So when we think about how do we address safety, let's say I'm a case manager with my clients, one of the first things I like to do is think about what may make them feel unsafe. And that's the first thing, you know, is putting yourselves in the other person's shoes. What sort of safety situation did they come from? Was it safe for them to walk places, or were there significant amounts of kidnapping? That's important because if you're asking somebody to go to the bus stop, walk 5 blocks to the bus stop, you may need to have more lead time. You may need to have more reassurance. You may need to partner with them or provide more instruction or break it down into smaller steps because you understand that that is a place that was unsafe before they got here. It's also important to think about if people are from informant societies or depending on the type of service, let's say they're receiving mental health service or domestic violence service, that issues of confidentiality may have been way lower in the country, in their country that they came from or the country that they were in before they got to the US. And these issues may have been highly stigmatized. So how are you going to create a safe space for them? How are you going to assure them that that gossip or disclosure isn't going to happen? So really putting yourself into their shoes and saying, gosh, coming from these types of circumstances, what would I be worried about? one of the low-hanging fruit on this is to really make sure that there's signs posted in multiple language that tell people about their rights, that tell people about confidentiality, that you make sure that people aren't doing casework in the lobby, because what may seem not sensitive to me as an American-born person may be very sensitive to someone else, or even just the act about talking about somebody's case in front of other people may signal to other people in the lobby that things are going to be disclosed. Another thing is to really make sure that your confidentiality forms and your client rights forms are being used at the very beginning of your work, and that they're really not these cynical exercises in compliance because someone tells you that you have to do them, but you're using these as a vehicle to proactively talk about safety, to talk about confidentiality, to talk about client rights. So now we're going to move into trustworthiness and transparency. And again, these principles are really based on what's often eroded by trauma and what we seek to bridge or recover. As I said before, our clients have lived in places where the rules may not have been clear, or they may change depending on who's in power and the whim of that person. Who they trust may be small. Some have lived in really repressive and informant societies, and many have experienced betrayal. One of the hardest stories that I heard as a counselor was a family who had been next to a neighbor, and they had raised their boys together, and they were very close, and they really considered their neighbors as family. And when the sectarian violence broke out in their country, that the mother, the next door neighbor who was the mother, said to my client, "Things are different now. I will hunt your son like a dog in the streets." And that sense that everything that they had known, that sense of trust, that sense of security was really eroded by that. And many of our clients have experienced that. So knowing this, it really helps you pace yourself in your interactions, knowing trust may take time. And you may not get people's story or what you need on the first interaction with someone. You also may have to do a lot of proacting, setting things up before you engage in a conversation that you may be difficult. So for instance, you may say, "I'm going to ask you questions about this. And the reason why I'm going to ask you questions about this is because I want to help you achieve that." And a lot of the clients are worried that if they answer these questions, I'm going to share them with other people. But what I want to let you know is I won't share them. And in fact, I don't even have to record your answer in your file. So before you ask a sensitive question, before you engage in a conversation, you want to be really transparent and model that, and do it in a proactive way where you're kind of front loading that. Client rights, as we talked about on the last slide, is another thing that can really be effective in helping increase trust, not just a form. And if you don't have them for your organization, think about what are your clients' rights. At the very least, talking to them about being treated with dignity and respect, where they can go if they feel like they aren't being treated that way. That is the very basis of this, and being able to talk about them at the very beginning with clients is really important. One of the things that I often do is in the first session, when I'm meeting with a client for whatever reason, is to say, it's important to me that people know what the rights that they have within this agency and within the United States. That way, you know what to expect, how people should be treating you, and where to go if you don't feel you're being treated well. And that's always a really important thing that I lead a lot of the first sessions with. So mutuality is a way of restoring the power balance and creating really true collaboration with the client, recognizing that they have deep knowledge that you don't have, and that you need that knowledge to create a care plan or to move forward in a way that's both successful and meaningful for the client. Not just successful in what you think should happen, but successful in that it's meaningful for the client. I often will say, from what I've heard from you today, you've identified X, X, and X issues. Which of these things is most bothersome to you? Or which of these things would you like to address first? That really creates that mutual collaboration. When I'm wearing my hat as a counselor, I'll often say, I've been to school and learned some skills around coping and recovery from trauma, but I don't know what it's like to survive a war in the Congo or to live for 9 years in a refugee camp. And I need you to tell me about that so we can move forward together and so that you can achieve the things that you want to achieve. I want you to tell me what I got wrong. Now, that's really different than saying, let me know if I got anything wrong. If you go to the doctor and they say, let me know if you have any symptoms or side effects, that's really different than saying, if you have these side effects, I want you to call me. So using your power to really increase that mutuality and collaboration by saying, tell me what I got wrong. Where do you want to start first? Out of those things that I mentioned, what is most important to you? And a tried and true one during any sort of first session with the client is there anything I didn't ask you that you feel is important to tell me? That's always a great one to end that first session with the client with. So empowerment and choice. Many of the clients we serve have been powerless and have had choices taken away from them. Trauma-informed care really seeks to restore some of that. It also recognizes that because of clients' experiences, it can be harder for them to be empowered and make choices. And it gives us the awareness that we can develop some patience with that. You know, if somebody's been in a refugee camp for 9 years, one of the ways that they survive emotionally, when you have this great and profound uncertainty with life, one of the ways you survive emotionally is to live in that moment. But then you get to the US and you need agency and empowerment yesterday. And that can be very difficult for the people we serve. So the knowledge of this, as I said before, can really make us more patient. It can also be helpful to break things down into smaller pieces. So instead of having people take 3 buses and do 3 transfers the first time out on a bus, we do a trial run where they get on and they get off at the next stop and they go back. So giving these manageable ways for people to be successful. Giving people the opportunity to make small choices. Would you like to come in at 1 or 2 p.m.? Would you like to do it on Tuesday or Thursday? Just little opportunities like that can really be important. The other thing is most of us got into this work because we want to help. And sometimes a desire to help, or even a sense of impatience and being overstretched, can cause us to step in and solve for clients. So consider that this could really be robbing them of the opportunity to restore some empowerment and choice. That doesn't mean throwing them into the wilderness and saying, you just have to go out and do it on your own. But doing things like I talked about with the bus stop is breaking things down into smaller bits where they can be successful. Asking questions like, what have you tried already? Or who do you turn to in times like this? Or who do you know who can support you in that can be really helpful in restoring empowerment and choice. And then I'm going to talk briefly about culture a little bit. It's important to recognize that not only that what people perceive as traumatic may depend on their individual temperament, experiences, history, and more, how they interpret what has happened to them, how they make meaning of it, and what they find healing and where they find healing depends on numerous aspects, including cultural aspects. It's really important to keep in mind that what may be true for us as a reaction or meaning may not be true for other people. For example, in clinical work, somebody having flat affect or not presenting any emotion would be a sign that they're highly traumatized. But when I worked with people, I'm thinking in particular from Northern Mongolia, especially elderly people, that is not what it indicates at all. In fact, it denotes incredible maturity in that person. It doesn't denote being highly traumatized. So holding that loosely, and a first step in understanding this is really looking at all the ways that your history and your culture impact what you think and what you believe about the world and trauma, especially for those of us who are white, privileged, American-born. We often interpret the ways in which our culture and our history are, and this is written through the DSM and other places, is normative, and it absolutely is not. So we've got to absolutely unpack that. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Sasha for to take us through to the end here and questions.
Thank you, Beth. That was a very nice overview of looking at some of these principles in action. So I want to just contrast what Beth went through with some ideas and examples of what we might hear at different times when we're in environments that either ourselves are making a misstep or maybe someone else around us is. And I just want to emphasize that all of us may do this at some point or another. And so the idea here is that we can pick out and identify what is not very trauma informed, right? So here's an example. I got through it okay, so will you. Everyone has to do this. While that may feel like it could be an empowering gesture for someone, it really is not, because it erodes that sense of self-empowerment for the individual. So we can contrast that with saying many clients we support have experienced what you are experiencing. This is allowing us to really connect and make it a commonplace and normal place in which clients can receive care from their staff around what to expect, and really appreciating how hard and difficult it might be for them at a particular time in their resettlement. Here's another non-trauma informed one. I already told you about this benefit ending, right? So again, slowing down, pacing ourselves, not meeting our client or individual with impatience, understanding that that slightest provocation could trigger a trauma response. So instead, we may approach saying, you know, your resettlement benefits are ending soon. I need to explain to you what may happen when this takes shape. Remember that client could become overwhelmed or forget, or maybe become agitated in how you may say something in a non-trauma informed way. Another one. All refugees do this for survival. They're just manipulating me and my team. Oh no, huh? That might be a big misstep to state. So again, approaching that from a trauma-informed way, clients may need resources and they may need time to meet their immediate needs, and they may be unsure of who to trust and how to trust. So resist thinking that the client's behaviors are purely for manipulation or for some sort of self-gain. Here's our last one. Why is the patient so reluctant to talk about what happened to them? I need to know this information to complete my assessment, right? So slowing down, remembering to meet our client with compassion, and understanding that our clients have had to go through a lot of different questions and interviews and assessments and processes just in order to become a refugee and to be resettled to a country like the United States. So a trauma-informed response to that might be, when you go to the doctor, she will see your scar and she may want to know what has happened. She's concerned about your health. Remember, too, that the intakes and the assessment forms that we have may feel re-traumatizing. So how you frame the questions and how you inform the person about your concern will build some trust and rapport, which is ultimately restorative and may support somebody in recovery from trauma. We have a case study here that we wanted to introduce and allow people to reflect on. Again, this is a gesture in thinking about when a non-trauma informed incident might happen. So a newly arrived client, Mamta, is waiting to see her caseworker. And while she is sitting in the lobby, she sees a different client exiting the caseworker's office. Mamta overhears the caseworker talking to their colleague. One of the staff states, "I don't know why he thinks it's so hard. I've been through worse. He just needs to get a job and everything will be better." What do you think went wrong in this example, and what could we have done differently? I'll invite people to respond in your chat box to this question, to these questions.
I'll also page back to show the slide itself, so you can keep that in mind as you
I'm seeing a lot of responses come in. Confidentiality was broken, or talking about the client in front of another client in the waiting room. It wasn't sensitive. Trust was broken. Not being empathetic. It's disrespectful. Oh my gosh, yes. All these responses are coming in. It's so belittling. Absolutely. It's unprofessional. You know, I want to say that, you know, sometimes these things may happen despite our attempts at being trauma informed. An occurrence like this may occur in our settings, and it might be the physical design of our waiting room spaces. And the staff may need some support on how to become more trauma informed when going through some of those physical spaces. What is important, I think, about this scenario is that we all recognize the erosion of safety, which Beth really talked so clearly about, and how our work is so often around building that sense of safety and trust with our clients through our relationships with them. So what this person is perceiving in the waiting room is really critical to how she may then engage in services within our agency setting, right? So we hopefully work to not have that happen, but again, some coaching, some assistance with the caseworker might be needed, and reestablishment of what we mean by confidentiality, because in many different cultures and contexts, this may look different. So if we have some shared understanding around that, our practices in practice may look different and certainly may be better suited to receive the client. Another thing I want to mention here is that the waiting room, as an example itself, is essentially like a hotspot. You can think of this space and place where our clients are engaging in our services, are receiving the benefits of our programming, as most likely places where something could go astray. It's sort of this hotspot for potential activation of that trauma response. So to be even more deliberate and intentional in how you create a welcoming and inclusive space, and certainly work to not have these types of missteps occur in the first place. So I just really wanted to bring that case example up for us as we explore when we see non-trauma informed happen, and instead how we can become more trauma informed. As we look at rounding out our training today on trauma-informed care and how we've looked at building trauma awareness on these different levels, organizationally, programmatically, and on an individual level, we want to emphasize how important it is for us to support clients, whether you're in resettlement, whether you're in another sector, whether you're working on integration, whether you're providing more trauma-sensitive services. These are the three areas of care and potentiality in terms of the trajectory that we're helping our clients through. We're looking at recovery. So what we mean by that is that we're pacing our services in a way that over time, a person may recover from the adverse and traumatic experiences that they may have endured. We're supporting resilience. We're embracing a strength-based approach to our work, where we're allowing people to adapt and learn from and develop new skills to move forward in their lives by offering empowerment and resiliency in our services and in our programming. These can be the smallest micro engagement encounters you have with a client, and they can be very programmatic in terms of how your programming is set up in the first place. And then the last one, which we want to emphasize here, is on post-traumatic growth. And there's a lot of work, particularly that's come out in positive psychology, that looks at when people have experienced trauma or adverse events, that sometimes a new narrative, if you will, or a new identity, a positive sense of the self can come because of the trauma that they have survived. So a really important takeaway with all of this is that all three of these vehicles, if you will, recovery, resiliency, post-traumatic growth, may exist at the same time in the programming that you are doing, in the one-on-one encounters and engagements you're having with clients. And importantly, we'd like to begin our presentation today by emphasizing that many trauma survivors are so much more than their trauma. And I think it's important to remember that and be thoughtful of that. And one of these quotes I have here is from a colleague of mine who was a trauma survivor who provided refugee casework services. And just because I'm a refugee does not mean I have PTSD, right? I think it's very important for us to remember that many people find ways to support their own healing through their own self-processes, through community and other mechanisms, or maybe they may benefit from more trauma-specific services. There are a number of resources which we'd like to point you to, which Switchboard has compiled, that are supportive to moving trauma-informed care along. We have a second part webinar that we'll be doing that looks more at escalated moments and how to support de-escalation. We hear this happen a lot in casework and in resettlement services in general. So we look forward to having you join us in our second part to this series on January 29th.
Great, thank you, Sasha. This is Meg chiming in again. And you'll see that Rebecca has dropped the links to these resources into the chat, including, I'll emphasize, the information guide at the top, Trauma-Informed Care Movement Towards Practice. This is an information guide that replicates the content of today's training in a format that's designed to be an easily downloaded resource for you to access and reference over time. So that's what you see as the screenshot here. And these will all be sent tomorrow to you, so 24 hours after the start of the training, as an update over email. So in our final 12 to 15 minutes, we'll take questions. We received so many interesting questions so far, so please continue to add those in chat and Q&A. Because of the volume, I don't think we'll be able to get to all questions, but I'll mention right now up front that any remaining questions you can submit to switchboard@rescue.org or visit our website and submit a technical assistance request if you have a more in-depth question. So to kick off Q&A, I think I'll start with a question for Beth. We received a question that relates to supporting clients who are demonstrating symptoms of trauma but resistant to counseling or therapy referrals. Do you have any recommendations for handling this situation?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so first of all, I would say that there's a lot of different ways that people heal. And so sometimes the fact that they're resistant to counseling referral or therapy referral is not just because of quote unquote resistance, but because they may be giving you information. This isn't the reason, this isn't what is healing for me. This isn't what I need to heal. It also could be because they don't know enough about what you're referring them to. So have you really thought out and kind of developed an explanation for what mental health services are, how they get there, what they'll do in them, what the hope for them is? So do they have enough information? And then the third thing is, it may be wise, because it may be that the mental health services within that community don't really know how to work with people from other countries or cultures or that type of trauma. So even though it's easy to say, boy, this person needs therapy and they should go, word gets out in the community and people may say, and rightfully so, I know a lot of people who went to those services and they were very disrespectful of their beliefs or their culture, or they went 7 times and they never had an interpreter. So to bring all that up to say there's no real one answer to that, I think it's unpacking, why do we believe it's resistance, and have we asked enough questions to even know it's resistance? And if so, where is that resistance located? Is it because we haven't hit the place of meaning or healing for them? Is it because they don't have enough information? Or is it because they actually are acting wisely because the services aren't really appropriate for them? And depending on the answer to that question, that tacks us in the direction that we need to go. Do we need to connect them to other types of healing or services or community? Do we need to do some advocacy to improve services in our community, or create a support group if there isn't really good individual counseling services? Do we need to write grants to get more money to get somebody that on staff that can address these needs? You know, fingers crossed, we always love to be successful in those types of grants. So I wish I had one pat answer for that, but I think it really is like peeling an onion. To know what to do next, you have to really understand the why.
Great, thank you for that, Beth. A lot of great ideas there. I'll direct the next question to Sasha on a topic that we talked about including today, but didn't have time to cover in great detail, which is, can you speak a bit about vicarious trauma and how this impacts or can potentially erode a trauma-informed care lens?
Actually, that's such a great question, and it is one that we toyed around with. Should we include a section on staff self-care and well-being and recognizing compassion fatigue or vicarious trauma in our respective settings, and strategies to support people with that? And we felt like it might be something, would certainly warrant its own type of teaching and webinar for sure, because there's a lot of great work coming out with that. I think that the trauma-informed care approach as an organizational movement is really concerned about this in the workplace. And as a result, you know, some of the tools that are cited in our info sheet can guide you on an organizational level through how you can create better supports and systems within the workplace to support people with staff self-care and well-being. I think what's important, you know, not to get totally derailed on this topic and take us in a completely different direction, but it's really wise for organizations to develop these systems and to do it with a lot of thought and intention. And on an individual level with staff, is to first recognize that some of the same responses that you see when we talked about that trauma response, that those may arise in you as you become overstressed or overworked or overburdened, or perhaps as a caseworker, maybe you have had a similar lived experience as somebody that you are working with. So that's why it's really critical to have good staff supervision in place that is trauma informed and is responsive to supporting the individual, as well as the individual cultivating some self-awareness around when some of these natural reactions may arise. And that, I think, is the spirit of a lot of good work that has come out of supporting staff self-care and when and how to recognize vicarious trauma. I think we'll touch a little bit on that in the second part webinar as well. And certainly when we're looking at when your own response may get activated when somebody's experiencing a heightened moment of escalated situation or crisis. And that's, I think, important to just remember. We'll touch a little bit more on that in our second part webinar.
Thanks, Sasha. That's a great question and response, and something Switchboard has also been looking at closely. If we know there's a big appetite and need for training in this area, so if there's something specific to your organization, if you are an ORR-funded organization, I would always encourage you to reach out to us via our TA request form online, or you can always contact us at switchboard@rescue.org. This is something that we're hoping to dedicate more time to in a future training. I think I'll ask another question to Beth related to different manifestations of trauma. So do you have recommendations for a client who may not be familiar with trauma in so many words, but is experiencing somatic concerns that the provider suspects are related to trauma?
Yeah, I would. So the first question I always ask myself is why do I need to know that information, and does it change the course of my individual service plan? So for example, let's say that somebody has significant stomach pain, and I think it's because they've got a lot of stress in their life and they've had significant trauma. The fact that I think that doesn't really matter, because the next best practice is to really go make sure and rule out any stomach issues and to connect them to a provider and have the provider, the primary care physician, make that determination, not me. So sometimes in the course of my work, I find myself asking questions that I then kind of have to back up from and go, you know, I don't need to spend time on that question right now, because it doesn't change the trajectory of the individual service plan and what I'm going to do next. Now, let's say they've gone to a provider and they have had all sorts of workups and they've been able to find no physical cause for the pain that they're having. Then typically what I would do is really talk about how the body reacts to trauma and stress. The muscles tighten, blood rushes away from the extremities to the core. Generally, when people have persistent somatic complaints, it's not in their head. It's a real physical reaction to chronic or toxic stress and the reactivation of that trauma response. And it's actually doing things in their body. So I try to make that connection to say, a lot of times when people have incredible stress and worry, it really tightens their muscles and it can cause headaches. And so one of the things that we want to talk about is, what can we do to make these headaches be less painful and occur less often, and some of that may have to do with learning how to relax your muscles. So keeping it very practical and not necessarily getting way into the psychological impacts of the trauma, but really making that very real and very true mind-body connection, and then talking about, how that can help us either lessen this problem or solve this problem so that they can do the things that they want to do in life, so that they can have less pain and care for their children more, look for a job more, participate in life more. So that's generally the way that I approach those types of issues. But I also think it's important, there's been a kind of a thought out there that refugees are high somatizers, and I would say that if you talk to any primary care physician, everybody across the world is a high somatizer, because what we go through and what we feel and what we experience, our bodies react to it, and it causes pain and it causes distress, and that is very real and not in people's head.
Great. Thank you, Beth, and thank you everyone for all your great questions. There are many more, and like I mentioned, please stay in touch with us if there are other things you're interested in answering or having us try to answer. Before you sign off today, I would so appreciate it if you're able to complete Switchboard's feedback survey. Rebecca is going to drop the link into the chat right now, and depending on the way you joined Zoom, it may already be open in your web browser. The survey is less than a minute, and it is so useful to us in helping us improve our training going forward. You'll see in the survey that we'll ask you whether you feel that we achieved our learning objectives today. As a reminder, those are that by the end of today's training, you'll be able to define trauma awareness and recognize it through examples, describe principles of trauma-informed care in practice, name individual and agency-based strategies to nurture trauma-informed programming, and then discuss the role of cultural considerations in trauma-informed care. While you complete that feedback survey, I will put up our contact information. You've heard me mention Switchboard a few times, and I'll answer a final question that we received on this. When we say Switchboard is available to provide TA to ORR-funded organizations, we mean that Switchboard is here to answer your questions and provide training related to any Office of Refugee Resettlement funded program that serves refugees and other ORR-eligible populations. So you can learn more about Switchboard on our website, which you see here, and of course, don't hesitate to reach out if you'd like to discuss anything further. With that, I see we are at time, so I will close the webinar here. Again, one final plug for that feedback survey. It is so useful to us, so I would really appreciate it if you have a moment to complete that. And I'll end by thanking today's co-host, Rebecca Mulqueen, and by giving a huge thank you to our facilitators, Sasha Verbillis-Kolp and Beth Farmer. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining.
Thank you.